Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Daniel Clarke from Kennedy's Legal Solutions, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our panel discussion focused on why we should care about psychological safety at work. Now, before we proceed, I'd like to inform everybody that today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the Dive-In website at a later date. We welcome questions and we invite you to provide questions in the event chat box. Whilst we have no doubt that we will receive a number of questions, our panelists will do their utmost to answer as many as possible. So, the subject of psychological safety at work is certainly a very topical one, and it's one that I myself believe in very deeply. Before moving on to the discussion, I'd like to share a very personal story. This issue came to the fore for me in 2020, following the murder of a gentleman called Ahmaud Arbery in the US. Like Mr. Arbery, I'm a black man and I enjoy jogging. And the realization that even jogging could jeopardize my life and the life of someone who looks like me shook me to my core, in all honesty. However, what helped me to realize that, my psychological well-being was important was the fact that a number of my colleagues here at Kennedy's came and simply asked me how I was doing. To say that I was touched by this would be an understatement, simply because I wasn't aware, nor did I think that anybody had my psychological well-being in the workplace, deemed it as important as I did. So that simple gesture really helped me to understand why this topic is so important even today. I'm the only Black employee here at Kennedy's in Asia. So as you can imagine, the understanding that was shown to me on that day was something that I'm forever grateful for. So to further discuss the importance of psychological safety on the workforce, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First off, I'd like to introduce Melinda Yon, who is the General Manager, Singapore and Senior Consultant for APAC of Roffey Park Institute. Melinda is going to be our moderator for today's discussion. Our other panelists are Steve Gibbs, who is the Head of Claims Asia Pacific General Assurance at AIG. We have Effies Insights, who is the Chief Business Officer, Life and Health Digital Solutions at Munich Re. We have Liana Attard, who is the Commercial and Sales Leader, Multinational Client Group Leader, AMIA at Mercer. And last but by no means least, we have May Len Kwok, who is the Regional Head of APAC at CIPD. Just one more thing before moving on to the discussion is that we have designed a Padlet board with some resources that you, the audience, may find very interesting. You can find a link to this in the chat box for this event as well. So without further ado, Melinda, I'd like to hand over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. And also a big thank you to you, Daniel, for your introductions and for sharing your story. And actually, I wonder how many of us have a similar story to share or something around psychological safety in the workplace. Professor Amy Edmonston either reinvigorated or recoined the term psychological safety over 20 years ago, and she refers to it as having one's voice, a belief that one's voice, the candor is really valued and it needs to be heard, and that it is safe to speak up, particularly in regards to work-related ideas, questions, concerns, and even mistakes. So when we're feeling psychologically safe, it means that we have no fear to express ourselves either in our team or in our organization, and that there's a trust. We trust each other with judgment, that we feel that we can fail without being labeled, and that we have a voice and our opinions matter and can be said without being shamed or even embarrassed. And interestingly, since the pandemic, it would appear that for many, that the levels of psychological safety and trust have increased within many organizations and teams, to the extent whereby there've been more opportunities for people to be more comfortable and confident in authentically expressing their feelings about anxiety or stress or burnout, or even around family and childcare and well-being issues. If we put psychological safety in context to the dive-in theme of building braver cultures, an important part of psychological safety is also valuing diversity and equity and inclusion, just like Daniel's story earlier. So, it's important that employees need to feel themselves, be themselves, their whole selves, race, ethnicity, background, and any other part of their identity without feeling any judgment, for want of anything better, so that we really are able to create and cultivate this inclusive workplace environment. And so just setting up the context of psychological safety and how we see it for our discussion today, what we'd like to do is actually start off with a Slido panel. Some of you may have seen this jump onto the screen a little bit earlier. Thank you very much. You'll also notice that in the link, there is or a chat box, there's going to be a link or a QR code, or you can hold your phone up right now and scan that code. Now, I should just add that this is completely anonymous, and the idea is just for us to get a bit of a sense of how are you feeling around psychological safety in your organization. So I notice we have over 70 participants on the call today, so I'm really hoping that we'll get a high response of the poll. Let's see how many people can join, so we get a real sense of where people are feeling at the moment. So you'll see, because it's active, it's going to be sliding up and down, and that's totally fine. And I can see the number of people are growing. So perhaps while everyone's having a chance to express their level of psychological safety, one thing I'd just like to add around this topic is sometimes we get asked about what's the difference between psychological safety and trust. And absolutely there is, they do need to work together, and trust is incredibly important. It's also one of the key components actually to building psychological safety and trust. And for those of you that may have already checked out the Padlet link, you may notice that there are some activities and self-diagnostic tools around trust, as well as some reports and some really other interesting information for you to be able to take away today. So I see so far we've got 55, which is great. So thanks very much. And if I look at this, and I think we can all see that maybe we're right in the middle. So maybe there's some levels of psychological safety and trust, but maybe there's, oops, we've got a few more. Okay, so maybe between 3 and 4. So that's certainly better than 1 and 2. And as I was thinking about this earlier today, I was wondering what if you were to do this test or this poll 2 years ago before the pandemic, I wonder what the levels of psychological safety would have been like. So I suppose what would be good now, and thank you very much everyone for participating in that. By the way, it's live, so if anyone that's just joined, you're welcome to also add, or if you need to change your response, that's fine too. But what I'm really excited about today is because psychological safety is such a key component to the workplace that it's a really important topic. And I'm delighted that we have 4 amazing panelists that are with us here today that are going to be able to share their personal insights and experiences in various roles, but also some insights about working with clients and other and partners to see what might be working for them. So on that note, we're going to start the panel discussion with our first question. And particularly, I suppose it makes sense given, we've just come out of the pandemic. It's very relevant to really being able to, I suppose, discuss and compare experiences. So the first question that I think would be quite nice to start off is asking each of our panelists, what impact has the pandemic had on psychological safety and trust, and creating this inclusive work environment? And if anyone has any kind of data to support this, then we would love to hear that. And I suppose, if I think about our panelists today, and their various experiences, I was thinking that might be nice to start off with those that are panelists that are working with teams, leading teams, especially remote teams. And maybe if I could start with you, Steve, for your insights on this one.
Sure. So, look, I lead a team of approximately 500 people across many countries across Asia Pacific, and our experience of COVID was that it actually had a positive impact on creating trust and creating a more inclusive working environment. And thinking about it, I could think of sort of 2 reasons, right? So first of all, working remotely in some respects leveled the playing field. Okay, it didn't matter where you sat or who you were. You sort of all had fairly similar access to one another. And what it stopped was, and I think we've all been in office environments where cohorts who are more like-minded will coalesce around events or things. Maybe it's going down to the pub on Thursday night for a drink and those sorts of things. And these groups form. I think with COVID and the pandemic, a lot of that went away, right? And people were more intentional with how they interacted with one another. And it just sort of, my experience in speaking to my managers who in turn manage teams, I would easily have spent tenfold the time with people who are less like me than perhaps pre-pandemic. And working through all my line managers, it was a fairly similar experience. And that's not just with line managers. We've had various interactions with people at all levels of the organization because there was just more access to one another. Second thing is, people over time brought more of themselves to work, right? As the pandemic went on, we gave up trying to wear decent clothes to work, most of us. People tended to wear what they tended to dress how they normally dress and bring more of who they are to a work environment. We met each other's children, wives, partners, pets. We sort of laughed with one another at our own homemade haircuts. So we've sort of been through quite a lot together. I think that adds a level of authenticity, I think is the word you used, Melinda. I think that's right. And sort of layers of depth to many relationships that I don't think we would have achieved but for the environment that we were thrust into. And what I've seen as we've returned to the work environment, and I'm in the last month meeting people who I've never laid eyes on in my life, and it's like meeting old family friends. And there is a real openness and sort of trust in that relationship. So that's our experience.
Thanks, Steve. I saw you smiling, Effie. Anything you might like to also share or add to that?
No, I was smiling because Steve mentions about the personal aspect there, because my dog certainly has been the star in a few calls myself. So I'm pretty sure everyone knows about my dog by now. But coming back to the question, right, in terms of the pandemic, I think pandemic really magnified, I would say, the impact of the psychological safety. I think, Melinda, earlier you mentioned about voicing out in opinion, right? So I think in the past, I would say psychological safety is more in the work context, and work here is really in the office context. Are you comfortable to speak your opinions in meetings? Are you afraid to be yourself? Like, for example, you're not going to come in a t-shirt, for example, right? Are you afraid to make mistakes, to try a new thing? But now with the working from home or even working remotely entirely during the pandemic, and I think most of our companies now, including Munich Re, right, we approaching the hybrid working, and then you're going to have that work and personal life. And to me now, the psychological safety become a little bit blurry, right? It goes beyond work. We talk about the childcare, we talk about the elderly care, even the comfort level, the health risk perspective. I mean, I'm not sure when the pandemic is over, but even people have a different tolerance level in terms of the risk coming to the office. Balancing the personal and the work and the timing of work. I think Steve earlier mentioned about the same playing field, and I think this is probably true in a very remote type of teams where now you get an equivalent that you don't spoil someone in the office versus somewhere far away. But at the same time, I think now with the hybrid and the frequency of people coming to the office is actually different, right? Because you have a different personal circumstances. Actually, what I wonder is whether there is going to be an impact on that, right? Does one lose opportunities or getting opportunity because of it? Does it change other people's perspective on them because of the way they're coming to the office or working from home? Do they have less visibility or social connection? Do they be, I think Steve mentioned also being intentional of reaching out to people, right? So I think that's the first aspect, so to speak. And relating to that, I think is around the communications, right? When people are in the office, you know where to reach them, you know where their desk is, you can drop by anytime, you know where the meeting. But now when people were at home, there is a pattern, and different people have different pattern of when they are working, right? Depending on their schedules. There's also inconsistency in the way the communication pattern. Some people are very comfortable in turning on video all the time. Some of them not really ready to show themselves in pajamas or t-shirt, right? So it's kind of you have a different level of comfort that people experiencing, and I think this is important because they're having this openness, I guess, within the team is really the key characteristic, right, of the psychological safety. And I think this is so important that I think every team should make conscious efforts to ensure that psychological safety, right? And then lastly, I think you mentioned about any data to support, if any, and I check inside, and I think you mentioned around the diversity, equity, and inclusion as well, right? And Munich Re in Asia, we also started that journey back in 2021. So we hosted, various spotlights, the gender, the cultural diversity, I think like Daniel mentioned earlier, right? The generations. And as part of that evolution, right, in 2022, we built our collective, say, appreciation on this differences and on the potential bias that comes out of it. And it's really the impact of it in terms of inclusion in the workplace, right? I try to find some statistic because Munich Re definitely aspire to have that workplace environment that allows everyone to have a more open conversations, right? Two-way communication, to understand each other's perspective, creating this environment of team spirit. So based on the two numbers that I have, glad to report that 100% of the new joiners as of June 2022 are proud to be in Munich Re and would recommend Munich Re as a good place to work. So I guess this is good. In terms of the turnover rate, like the voluntary turnover rate over the last few years, I would say is about 6 to 9%. And 89% of those people who leaving us actually said that they were proud working with Munich Re. So I guess we are doing the right thing, and hopefully we continue in the right path going forward as well.
Yeah, thanks, Effie. Something I noticed from your shared experiences in the organisation, yours and Steve, was a lot around kind of authenticity and vulnerability. I can see, again, May and Liana nodding their heads. I suppose maybe Liana, just based on, what Effie just mentioned just now about some of the stats, and, I know you do a lot of reports, work with a lot of clients at Mercer. Is there anything that perhaps that you've observed?
Yeah, thank you, Melinda. Absolutely. And I actually found it quite interesting just listening to both Evie and Steve comment on the importance of inclusive workplaces and how much that contributes to psychological safety. And 100% correct. I mean, that's one of their key features for overall emotional well-being in the workplace. But both had very different perspectives as a result of the pandemic. So Steve, you were saying, you know, it actually fostered a more inclusive workplace because it leveled the playing field a little bit from a networking and access perspective. And then Evie, you were saying, yes, but as we move towards hybrid working, potentially we can create some disparity. So people who want to continue working in a hybrid fashion because of caregiving responsibilities, you know, require a little bit of flexibility because of distance to the office and travel time. And I read a really interesting report that said that, you know, we need to be conscious that, you know, the office can potentially become, you know, a first-class lounge for those that have the access and are happy to be there. And then we create a little bit of disparity between those out of sight, out of mind, and then they don't have the same learning and development opportunities and networking that those that are coming into the office do. So that one is a very topical point, and a lot of research being done around the importance of inclusive workplaces and the linkage to overall well-being. But interestingly, we actually ran a survey during the height of the pandemic around mental well-being, and there were 3 key areas that really came through that drove and impacted psychological safety. So we had a look at sort of overall well-being, our culture and social interactions at work, leadership and management support was a really big one. And then the 4th was around work demands and career development, regardless of whether it was a remote working arrangement or in the office. And interestingly, the results that came through showed 3 key areas. One was that the levels of stress for employees actually rose to 3 times higher than pre-pandemic. And employees were really looking to their employer to support, with 61% trusting that their employer was going to look after their well-being. But interestingly, at that point, so in July 2020, organisations were reporting only a third of them actually had integrated health and wellbeing strategies to support, and less than half of executives actually ranked mental health and psychological safety as a top concern for them. Now, a lot of that's changed now, but that's where we were at 2 years ago. And inclusive workplaces came up as well in the survey. So 61% of employees actually said that they received criticisms faced at work. 40% said they couldn't express themselves freely or bring their whole self to work. And interestingly, that was actually more dominant in females in particular, and they were ranking at 9 percentage points higher than their male counterparts in respect of being able to freely be themselves in the workplace. And then the third was that lack of control over one's work. And you almost think, you know, during the pandemic, maybe we had more control because, you know, we're working at home and we're being flexible, but actually it was trying to balance the various demands of the job and how and where, you know, you were doing your role. And it was all sort of blurring into one. And many individuals felt that they were unable to adjust the order of their job or the pace and when they could, you know, appropriately take breaks at work. So then fast forward a couple of years now, when hopefully we're at the end of the pandemic, having a look at results now, that stress number that I quoted to begin with, that actually hasn't gone down. It's actually gone up, really interestingly. So now we're at 81% of employees feeling at risk of burnout, which is up from 63% 2 years ago. So, you know, against sort of that backdrop, I mean, employees really looking to their employers now in this changing environment where we're really revisiting how we work, where we work, just that changing nature of the office and how we do business. They're trusting their employer to become more human, become more relatable, and connect with them on that and support that whole person, as opposed to when we look at well-being, restricting it to, you know, the physical needs or it being a HR priority. So there's huge opportunity there, I think, post-pandemic.
Leanna, thanks for sharing that. And I suppose something that you just mentioned there that made me think, oh, you know, HR responsibility, leadership responsibility, individual responsibility. Maybe we have a chance later on topic or discussion point to come back to. And while I mentioned that, actually, feel free of anyone that's joining us today, if you've got any questions, if you want to add those to the chat box, we'll see if we can come back to those a little bit later. But I'd love to hear, particularly given that Liana shared kind of, the data and some reports, maybe how May might be seeing that translated into action.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. How do we translate that into action? I think what I picked up on Liana on was the note about HR, and as a HR professional body, I think that's definitely a realm that we can speak on. So as part of sort of the pandemic, one of the things that we did notice was trust matters in a crisis, because that's when your emotions are the most heightened. Vulnerability will drive both the need for the propensity to trust, but you're also more vulnerable in terms of what you feel and what you seek from your leadership. And trust also helps your organization to generate resilience in order for you to deal with the volatility and the uncertainty and to actually be able to live through that together. So the way that we see psychological safety is it's that invisible glue that binds a team together, particularly during times of crisis. So if I kind of link that back to sort of well-being, for us, psychological safety is part of total well-being. We always hear about total reward, but we really need to think about total well-being. And as Liana mentioned just now, we're beyond about just looking at the physical now. It's no longer what was traditionally known as HSE, right? Which is sort of the health and safety executive, where you're looking at, are we using a ladder when we're climbing up high? Do we have our chairs adjusted? We're beyond that now. We're looking at, are we providing good quality work? Are we providing personal growth? Are we looking after health, the collective and social aspect at work, et cetera, financial well-being. So if we look at total well-being, absolutely psychological safety is there. So with that in mind, we do believe that there's a big role that HR needs to play. So in terms of how do we practice and promote these healthy emotions and promote high psychological safety at work, it's really about how do you encourage shared work goals in the workplace? Are you demonstrating employee support in provision of tangible as well as intangible resources for all employees to be able to access, irrespective of whether they're full-time, they're part-time, they're contract, they're gig workers, etc.? Are we displaying trust, empathy, and care? So particularly during the pandemic, one of the things that we promoted a lot more was, to make sure that you connect more, you care more, you share more. Anything that anybody has in their minds is always 10 times worse than the reality of the actual situation. So you're better off, expressing the reality of the situation than allowing people to come up with the rhetoric and the story in their own heads. Introduction of more independence in decision making, more flexibility in working hours, a guarantee of open and participative two-way communication, because that helps with building trust. So that links into what you were mentioning earlier about employee voice and the assurance of information sharing. If you're going to do that, make sure you follow it up with behaviors to endorse all of this. So behaviors that inhibit healthy emotions and high psychological safety would be, that frequent monitoring and controlling employees tightly. So, if we link back to what Evie was saying earlier about, we're moving into these realms of hybrid working now. We should really be moving away from presenteeism. Okay, if you're trusting people to work at home, trust that they're working at home. Trust in the outputs. Don't trust in hours that they're clocking. If they've walked away from their screen for a moment and it's not clicking green and it's now showing orange or red, it doesn't mean that they're taking a nap on the couch. It means that they might just be opening the door because Amazon is there. They're just taking 2 minutes to go make a cup of coffee. So it's really making sure that we go away from this managing component. Don't increase workloads thinking that, you've now saved time on commuting to work, so now I can give you more work. So bear in mind some of these parameters. So micromanaging, constant messaging, holding virtual meetings too frequently. We've gone into this dire straits of having one Zoom call after another, and really, treating not just those that are in front of you fairly, but always be mindful of those who are working from home, because that was something that we brought up earlier, right? We don't want to create this concept of an executive lounge at work. So always be mindful. Just because they're not present here right now, can't we Zoom them in? We can MS Team them. We can even put the monitor where the seat is, so it feels like they're around the table. Make everyone feel inclusive. So these are the little things that I feel that the HR can help to endorse. or any leader can help to endorse.
Yeah, thanks, May. And you've taken us really nicely actually into the second question, was what can organisations do or leaders do? What kind of strategies, processes or behaviours are important for fostering psychological safety? And I suppose some of the things I really took away from both your sharing with these questions just now is a lot around trust. And I think through that, in terms of, you know, being mindful as leaders of what our employees are doing already, is there's an element there around respect. You know, there's that trust, but there's also respect of people's time, of people's space, what they're doing. But also, like, you know, what you mentioned around that flexibility. And I think it's really important to note that, because I think that makes that certainly assists with creating that safe environment. And I think, you know, we underestimate communication and conversations, don't we? I mean, probably one of the simplest things. So maybe if I could ask Steve perhaps to share what he may have observed or in AIG.
Look, absolutely. I agree with a lot of what sort of Liana and May have said in particular. Okay, there is a lot around communication, and yeah, the days of just having a meeting with whoever's around and not looping in people who are, you know, via other channels, mate, they're long gone. They're not coming back. It's not even up for discussion. You've got to be making your sort of connection times accessible to people, you know, across time zone. So you've got to be mindful of time. You've got to be mindful of who's in the office, who's not. So yeah, 100% agree. So look, what AIG's done, they've done a few things. So first of all, they felt that we needed to have forums where groups sort of coalesce around certain issues or certain outlooks, and that there are forums where people can go to and discuss issues where people with a similar outlook will be present and sort of have a degree of support and connection. So these ERGs that were set up some years ago now, I think grew through the pandemic, and we now have 129 of them across 41 countries that are really sort of focused on things such as gender, interfaith matters, culture. You know, there's 129 of them, so a lot of different issues. And yeah, it's not only to promote that sort of network between people who have that sort of certain outlook, but they also sort of then generate events where they invite the broader community into their group to talk about their issues. And look, I make sure I get to as many of them as possible, and so do a lot of the leaders. I think it's important as a leader that you're showing you're engaged with a number of these different issues. Okay. You know, at a very basic level, and I think this comes down to basic leadership, right? I think, you know, people are working remotely. I think May's comments about not micromanaging people, you know, and look, let's be honest, it goes both ways. I'm a leader, so every time I tick green, I've got about 15 people who start pinging me to try and get in front of me to have a conversation. So it goes both ways, but it's really just sort of being a bit more respectful of people's time. And sort of, I know sort of through APAC, you know, people have gone, we put something at the bottom of every email we send saying, look, I've sent this email on my time zone on my day. Please don't think you have to reply to it until you're back in the office. Things that are as simple as that, just to create the expectation, or at least relieve people from the expectation that there's an immediate response required. You know, creating voice, little things. I think, sometimes it's the little behaviors that you do day to day and you embed within your team that sort of have the greatest impact. And little things like meetings. We rotate the chair of all of our meetings all the time. Okay. And what you find is that people who are in the group, who are not the leader of the group, will find their voice as chair of the meeting. But then what you find is other people in the groups tend to find their voice a lot more effectively when the meeting's being run by one of their peers rather than perhaps someone who's more senior than they are. And, you know, so, and then what we find from that is a lot of issues that perhaps wouldn't find their way to the discussion table, find their way onto the table and are discussed quite vigorously, which is really good, right? So that, look, I'd say there are a couple of things. One, organisational, but I think the other parts are behavioural. You know, I think even if as leaders you can have a few small things that make sure you embed day to day, people start to feel the trust, they start to feel the comfort. And, you know, to Liana's point, I do think there is a bit of stress around return to work and people finding their way, organisations finding their way in terms of how we work and continue to connect. Look, I just think all of those small behaviours, as a leader, you set the tone for your teams, is the best we can do at the moment. We're trying hard, but we've just got to continue to listen and adjust as we go through this return to work period, and creating those environments where people speak up is where we're sort of able to make those minor adjustments. But it's true, we're all figuring it out as we go back to the office. It's and I think as long as we recognise that, create the forum to discuss that and have that as something we can really talk about, that is probably the way we'll get there.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks for those tips too. It sounds like there's a lot of consciousness from the leaders to, you know, exemplify behaviour here. And I do recall reading or hearing something about mentoring. The AIG has also started a mentoring campaign. Maybe that was something that we may have discussed as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, we've had it for a few years now where what we've done is identified what we'd call diverse talent, okay? And recognizing that sometimes your development or progression through an organization, it depends upon the merit and how good you are, but there are also these informal networks of just people knowing who you are and having seen enough of you to be able to sort of speak up for you at a meeting 2 levels up that you're not at, to say, hey, I've worked with that person, they're really good, right? And so what we've done is created these, I guess, these networks. So identify sort of diverse talent and then really creating these sponsorship networks at sort of 2 levels further up the organization to sort of create that visibility and awareness and connectivity with diverse talent sort of moving through the organization. And you know, it is definitely having an impact. What we're seeing is, you know, if we look at our balance of you know, leadership positions, it's definitely moved materially in the right direction in the last 2 years, and there's certainly a clear visibility of who the talent are and how we're going to develop them.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. That's obviously really encouraging for different people within the organisation. How about anything at Unicari, Effie, particularly strategies, process, behaviours?
Yeah, so actually, you know, earlier May spoke from kind of the HR perspective, and I think Steve touched on the organization's perspective and perhaps the leader perspective. But I couldn't agree more, though, that psychological safety needs to be influenced from the individual team, right? Because you're not going to have meetings with your senior leaders or the CEO or chairman of the boards every single day, but you're dealing with your individual team every day, if not a few times a day. So maybe what I'm going to share is more from us as an employee and us as the managers, right? So to me, I think that the first thing that's crucial for me is the awareness, right? Like if you're not aware where you are, whether you're managers or whether you're employees in terms of psychological safety, then you won't know. So I think if we are managers, you know, we need to ask ourselves, you know, are we allowing our employees to speak up? How do we react when employee making mistakes? Do we give them time? Do we listen to when they're actually speaking during meetings? Or do we always think that our opinion is always right, right? And the same thing from the employees, do I feel that, someone, I'm going to be punished if I'm expressing new ideas? Is someone going to just dismiss my ideas? I think these kind of awareness, I think is important. So that's why having kind of just the in Munich Re, I think we do some workshops and training just to make sure we are aware. And at even the managers level, right? The leaders can influence the culture, but ultimately the managers are the ones that also action it, as well as the employees themselves. I like that walk the talk as well. Like earlier, I think we mentioned, for example, if we are managers and we said, we appreciate your psychological safety, but, if I teams you at 8 o'clock, I want you to respond by 8:01. This is not really a psychological safety that you're going to influence within your team, right? The same thing, I think communications also comes earlier as well, right? So if we say, yes, we can, give us your honest and constructive feedback, but your behavior is defensive, like, how is that going to encourage the psychological safety, right? In the next time, people will not even be safe to speak to you because you're not going to accept that feedback. Same thing about the open mindset as well, right? So, for example, if you shut down every idea that is not yours, and I'm not sure whether maybe some of us has this ego within us, perhaps this needs to go away, right? This is something a culture that we need to influence. That every idea is valid, every question is valid, and we need to open up. Or we need to give that sense of psychological safety to our own team. It's interesting that May talking about the teams and you're not green, that means you're taking a nap. But I do hope that it is okay to take a nap in between days, right? Like ultimately it is about a business outcome. If this works for you to make it more effective after that, obviously, please do so, and then you catch up some other time. People have worked effectively in different times, right? And lastly, I would say really more proactive in seeking the input and the feedback, right? The feedback is not one way, it's not from managers to the team, but it's really from the team to the managers as leader as well. Now, maybe not many of us are comfortable to do so, but this is again where the leader and managers really needs to get that behavior that it is okay for you to give me the inputs, right? Because if you shut down every feedback you get, then nobody is going to tell you anything, and the psychological safety will stop there, right? So I think in a sense, I think we need to demonstrate that openness. We shouldn't shut down people just because they're telling us something that we don't want to hear.
Yeah, good point there. And I can hear the comments echoing about the role of the leader, walking the talk and being able to embed this behavior, and not only allowing the voice, but also encouraging the voice. Liana.
Yeah, completely agree, Melinda, with both Evie and Steve. I mean, what I'm hearing is, and agree as well, this is much broader than, HR and setting policies or around, fragmented wellbeing policies that you might have in place, or programs or training. This is what we're talking about here today, is around employee experience, employee engagement, how colleagues are connecting back with the organisation. We've talked, I've heard words around culture, for example. And these are really, really critical to driving that positive employee experience, and that's connected to safety and trust. I mean, employees want to feel, at a broader level that even, how they're doing the work, or the work that they're doing, is meaningful and impactful. So it's enriching. So it's not only that they're meeting their career goals and they're being paid for that, but that their work is purposeful and fulfilling. And we've seen in research that's being conducted that organisations that are very clear around what their purpose is and their value, and colleagues can connect with it, are much more likely to have higher engagement scores and lower attrition scores as well. So it just means that organisations, they can leverage their broader business purpose to drive more enriching experiences for their employees and create connectivity. And then we talked a little bit before already around an inclusive workplace, but it's really about being embracing, so employees feel like they belong as well. And then the third is around being empathetic. With particularly post-pandemic, where we don't have those clear segregations between work and home, and we're even now like 24/7 in a connected world. Like I've got 2 phones on the go, I'm on here, we've got multiple devices, and employees are expecting a little bit of flexibility around how they manage all of that, like we've just heard as well, and how they manage themselves and their families. But I just wanted to finish with one point. I completely agree with what Evie was saying, that you can set that tone from the top, from a leadership perspective. You can put policies in place from a HR perspective. But if that practice doesn't filter down to your frontline managers or your people managers, all of that is wasted, because they're your frontline, they're your connection to people. And they're the ones that will put that into practice and emulate that and connect with colleagues. And that's where we've typically seen, even in like DEI practices, for example, things fall down, where you're checking all the boxes at the top, but it's not filtering down into the organisation. And that's that missing link. And we've got a ways to go there. But I think that's the biggest area of opportunity for us and for organisations in creating that positive employee experience.
Yeah, thanks very much, Liana. And I think that also kind of leads in nicely to the next question. So I've got 2 more, and I'm wondering, just for sake of time, if we kind of look at like top 3. And the first is, and I think you've kind of touched on some of things, Liana, and I can feel the pressure on leaders right now. But what advice would you give then for an organisation to create a psychologically safe working environment? Like, where would you begin?
I think, Linda and May, you mentioned this at the outset, like we're very clear around physical risks in the workplace. From an occupational health and safety perspective, we know what they are and we know how to manage them. We've put mitigation strategies in place. But when it comes to emotional well-being, psychological safety, much less tangible, and to get our arms around it. And I think even more so, we need to be much more deliberate around that. But I think there are a number of risks that we need to be aware of. So one, we've covered some of this already, but poor leadership and communication. Steve, you talked about this as well. Low participation in decision making, limited control over your workspace, lack of emotional support. So these are some of the risks, ambiguous roles and tasks, excessive workload, or even insufficient. So just acknowledging first and foremost, what are those risks, and then how do we address that? How do we deliver on total well-being and drive that positive employee experience? So I think there's a really big role that organisations can play in terms of managing flexibility in a meaningful way. Number one, we're not saying all roles can flex or we're working in a hybrid environment, but what is that cascading effect in terms of career development and opportunity, in terms of pay, in terms of benefits? How does that connect to a hybrid working environment and flexibility? Supportive leadership, and then just really thoughtful communications in terms of how we connect with employees and ensuring that cascades down as well.
Thank you. Wow, a lot to unpack there. How about yourself, May? All good tips, by the way. Thanks, Liana.
Very good, very, very useful as well. I think I would very much echo what Liana has said. And I'm going to pick up what she mentioned earlier. It's the piece about the line managers. That really is the missing link, because we often hear this concept about you join a company, but you leave your manager. And for a lot of folks, that's true, right? You believe in the purpose of the organization, and that all of that boils down to the difference between engagement and motivation as well. So for me, I think for a lot of organizations, it's still a buzzword. This whole concept of work-life balance, we've been talking about it for so long. Psychological safety, this is certainly not a new concept. It's been jumping around for so long, et cetera, et cetera. And even though most organizations nowadays are on hybrid working models, it's not a new model either. It's something that a lot of organizations have been doing for decades. So that to me very much still indicates that there's a lot of education, there's a lot of awareness that still needs to be bred within organizations, and I think that does really start with line managers. A lot of times, the conversations are had at the leadership level, and they may or they may not then trickle down, as Liana had mentioned earlier. And then even when it trickles down, is how much of it is then diluted. And you've got this whole concept of Chinese whispers in terms of how that can then change and what have you. Then on top of that, your daily work comes into play. And if this stuff is not embedded into your KPIs, then if it's not being measured, it's also not being done. So we're still at this point of, how much of people's well-being, how much of psychological safety, how much of diversity is actually built into line managers' KPIs. You know, again, if their main job is to drive numbers, the rest of this stuff is going to be put on the back burner. So for me, it's helping to educate that link between how all of this stuff is good for business as well. How all of this stuff brings back the humane approach to business. And I think, you know, for people to understand that good quality management is positively related to better health and better well-being, and that, you know, more than 3 in 5 workers feel that, you know, if their line manager, their supervisor or their boss is more approachable on issues like mental health, let's say, or allowing them to be their authentic self at work, then all the more they'll stay. So this is a direct link to motivation as well as a direct link to retention. And when we flip the conversation in a different way, when we're talking about, you know, what should we be doing to raise productivity, or what should we be doing to increase engagement, or what should we be doing to ensure that we've got better retention, to manage talent better? Well, actually, all of that stuff is linked to everything that we've been talking about today. So it's a matter of how do we then change that perspective into a business language that will then, you know, help stakeholders to open their ears and be more open-minded and be more receptive to this cause. And then we link all of that good stuff back to reward and performance management and what have you.
Yes, really quite holistic. Yes, Steve.
Can I make a comment, Melinda? Look, I just wanted to sort of comment on a couple of things Liana and May each said. You're absolutely right. Unless you're making your managers accountable and you're measuring and tracking that, you struggle to really affect change. And that's what we've found, right? And so that's, you know, we've definitely approached it that way with a lot of training. But then there's formalized upwards feedback processes that are part of your annual review that are capturing great data along a lot of these points. And that becomes part of the performance conversation that you have with managers. And look, you know, I think where we've progressed to, and I you know, we've been through some hiring in the last sort of 3-6 months. What you see now is when you're looking for leaders, it's not like the old days where you're just looking for someone who can do the technical aspect of the role. Very clear selection points around someone who is going to be able to lead and build that sort of team culture and team environment that we've been speaking about today. And I think we're very clear, certainly at our place, around those elements of very defined and clear aspects of the role of a manager and defined competencies that you know, we will assess candidates on. So agree with everything you say. It absolutely has to be measurable and tracked to get real traction.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And that's something for our HR teams to consider. I'm conscious that, Effie, I'm going to come back to you in a second for a quick wrap up on that question as well. I'm conscious that we also have some people on the call here who may like some tips. So I'm going to invite our panel to please, if you can use the chat function and maybe just share what are your 3 tips or recommendations for employees who need or want to raise a concern but are not sure, uncomfortable. So far we've kind of been looking more at the leadership side and the HR side, but what if we flip it and we look at those that are not, you know, in an environment whereby they have access to all the tools and insights that you've shared today. So maybe, and also maybe I'd like to invite also our participants today. If you've got any questions, we're ready and waiting to answer those in the chat box and also in the Padlet. So Effie, just maybe a quick wrap up on you on that one, on the on that last question about the advice.
Yeah, so actually listening to you know, Steve and Liana and May, right? I think one thing that maybe from my side to add is this culture of the continuous conversations, right? So Munich is quite big of promoting this continuous conversations, because really when you have this concerns, issues, whether it's work or personal within your team, it comes from the conversation and they need to be comfortable to speak to you, and it comes from the ground, right? So having that culture of having that continuous conversations and open feedback is important. So relating to your questions about, you know, unsure, uncomfortable, I hope you are comfortable to reach out to your immediate managers, at least to express your concerns and not. But if you are not comfortable, I think you need to find another alternative right? So I think in Munich, we do have what we call an employee assistance program, which is kind of providing kind of that confidential counseling session should you need to, if you're not really comfortable, to reach out to your managers. Second is perhaps even if it's not your immediate managers, perhaps you have colleagues where you are comfortable to share with, perhaps your mentor, perhaps other people outside your department, maybe someone with neutral party that you can speak with. I think to me that's important. Lastly, I know maybe HR, I would say it's kind of a neutral party as well, right? I mean, they're here for the employees. So I hope that you are also comfortable in approaching the HR, because I believe, I'm not from HR, but HR really is to also to get that feedback, right? And then to do something, whether it is at organization level or at manager's level, but it is something they want to hear. And I see Liana mentioned about therapists. I do agree. I think it's more just getting that feedback, and then we have to figure out something. But I agree, he's not a therapist, and managers are not therapists either. So yeah, thanks Melinda.
Thanks so much, Effie. And I can hear again, this communication, again, a bit of emphasis on HR, again on managers. I've taken away like so many different ideas from today. I just can't even keep up with writing down some of my key points. And usually I like to be able to summarize, but there's just so much, to be honest. And on that note, I would like to thank all our panelists very much for your contributions today, your insights, your authenticity with sharing. And again, I'd like to encourage everyone to use the chat box and the Padlet, but I'd like to also pass over to Daniel. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Melinda. Really appreciate that. First of all, just one bit of housekeeping before I wrap things up, which is to let everybody know, everybody who attended today's event will receive a copy of the Padlet board that'll be sent to you in due course. But all that's left for me to do is, number one, thank our panelists again, and thanks to you, Melinda, for your hosting of today's session. Really wonderful discussion. And thank you to our audience. We really appreciate your time today. We really appreciate you attending this session, and we really hope that you took as much out of it as we certainly did, because I know that our panelists received some great questions and obviously put forward some wonderful points, and we hope that these are useful to you going forward. So with all that being said, I'll simply say good afternoon, everybody from Singapore, and I wish everybody a wonderful day. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.